Hello, grade 10 history folks. So, as I mentioned, we're going to be moving into World War II. I've already put one PowerPoint on about the rise of Hitler. I'm putting a second one on today because this one takes a slightly different angle. And this one introduces us very briefly to the main leaders at the time that World War II was sort of shaping up. So, if you remember, our course so far has started in World War I in 1914. It goes to 1918. It ends with that big treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, very good, signed in 1919. And then we go into what they call the Roaring Twenties. Now, the Roaring Twenties, we also talked about why it roared. We talked about the rise of the automobile. Although it had been invented for a while now, the 1920s is when the price of it starts to come down, mass production, the industrial processes, the assembly line makes it more affordable. So cities are converting from, horse trails and that kind of thing into paved roads for cars. Street lights are appearing. Traffic laws are developing. Pretty exciting time. It's also the Roaring Twenties because of the economy. It's kind of booming. Although we did have a dip in the early 1920s, for the most part, most people were doing fairly well in the 1920s, particularly as we get past the hump of about 1924 and move on. So the economy is booming or roaring. That means industry is booming or roaring too. So think about Hamilton and all these steel plants that we have down in our beautiful city. They were bustling, they were booming, they were roaring. It's also the roaring decade because of partying. We're talking about big band jazz. We're talking about swing, the birth of a little bit of a revolution happening with regard to music. I mean, things are a bit more up-tempo, a big party's happening. That's part of the roar. We also talked about banning alcohol and prohibition, so people aren't allowed to transport, produce, or drink alcohol, but people were doing it anyway. We remember those little things? They were called speakeasies and blind pigs. So the parties were still happening, so the decade's still roaring in that way. And it's the rise of organized crime, because every time the government makes something illegal, like they did with alcohol, other people try and find ways around those laws. So we have the rise of organized crime. And we talked about a local criminal here in Hamilton. We also talked about a larger criminal a couple times in the course. I'm not sure how much I mentioned in these lessons, but Al Capone. So one of the most famous gangsters from the era, and organized crime and machine gun fights in the streets of Chicago and that kind of thing. Another way in which the decade roared, and so on. So from the Roaring Twenties, and then we went all the way up to October 29th, 1929, the stock market crash, so-called Black Tuesday, and that's where the economy takes a dive, and we had a lesson about that. And then 1929 all the way through 1939, largely known as the Dirty 30s, right? So this is just kind of a recap just to get us going. So the Dirty 30s, we talked about massive unemployment, about 1 in 3, give or take, about 1933, but 1 in 3 adults could not get a job. That's pretty significant. I mean, if 1 out of 3 people can't have any income. We talked about the drought in the so-called prairie provinces and all through that great area, which became known as the Dust Bowl. We talked about the locust. We talked about farmers moving off their homes, a lot of people losing their land and their homes and getting evicted and kicked out. We talked about soup kitchens. We talked about the On to Ottawa trek. We talked about how the Prime Minister at the time, Richard Bedford Bennett, got a lot of guilt and blame for the Great Depression. And then we talked about what eventually is leading us toward a lot of conflict. So if you remember, if you took a look at the other PowerPoint, okay, the first one that I uploaded about the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, there are a few key points in there I just want to go over now. So the first thing is, of course, is that Adolf Hitler was himself a veteran of World War I. And a lot of the guys that we now know today as Nazis were veterans of World War I. So I don't know if you know any of these names, but I'm just going to throw them out there. The guy who was going to become the head of the German Air Force, the so-called Luftwaffe, his name was Hermann Göring, and he was in World War I too. He's actually an ace. I think he was credited with 22 kills or something like that. Erwin Rommel, maybe you've heard of the Desert Fox, the brilliant commander credited with being perhaps the best strategic general of all of World War II. Erwin Rommel was a veteran of the First World War and so on. Well, so was Adolf Hitler. And not only was Adolf Hitler a veteran of the First World War, he rose in rank to corporal, I believe, and he also won 2 medals. He won the Iron Cross Second Class and the Iron Cross First Class. And this is for bravery under fire. He was also wounded no fewer than 3 times. Now, I'm not trying to sell Adolf Hitler as a hero. We know what Adolf Hitler was eventually to become, and we know what monstrous things he did, not the least of which being starting almost single-handedly World War II, certainly in the West, although Japan had already begun in their invasion of China and Manchuria in the 1930s, but in the West and in Europe, certainly Adolf Hitler is the one who almost single-handedly starts the war. He's also the primary individual responsible for the Holocaust. And I remember we talked about this in class, and many of you remember what the Holocaust was. The Holocaust was the deliberate targeting of people because of their religion. In this case, we're talking about Jewish people. So something on the order of 6 million Jews died during the Holocaust. And they died largely, although not all of them, but many of them died in a camp system, a concentration camp system. And in that camp system, in addition to 6 million 6 million Jews, 5 million other people died in or peripheral to that camp system. And that can almost, a lot of that blame can be laid right at the feet of Adolf Hitler. So why am I talking about his military career? Well, I wanted to give you a sense of the idea that a lot of Germans after World War I felt that they had been stabbed in the back by the Treaty of Versailles. And if you remember, the Treaty of Versailles punished Germany. It said they could only have a very small army. It took away a lot of their land. They had to pay billions of dollars to fix things. It's called reparation payments, and so on. So a lot of Germans felt like they had been betrayed, and not just betrayed by their leadership, but also betrayed by an international Jewish conspiracy and Jewish bankers and financiers and all this racist propaganda. So you remember, we already learned the word propaganda, right? So in this case, unfortunately, a lot of this racist propaganda was aimed at Jewish people, largely because Germany needed somebody to blame for their problems. So today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the conditions that were existing and some of the leaders that were popping up prior to and during World War II. Okay, so pause the video right now, and I want you to go to the content section of the hub, and I want you to open the PowerPoint, The Rise of the Dictators, and then come back to me. So pause the video right now, go open that PowerPoint, and then I'm going to go through it with you. Perfect, and welcome back. Okay, so slide 1 is just the title slide, The Rise of the Dictators. So we're going to go to slide number 2 right now, and we're going to talk about some of the worldwide problems that existed in the 1930s, right? So some of these things we've already talked about, but I want you to understand how those problems feed into World War II and kind of prepare the world to sort of be on these pins and needles. Now, before I talk to you about this first slide, can anybody remember back to the causes of World War I? We had MAIN, right? We had M-A-I-N. So we had M for militarism. This is the belief that countries can solve all their problems using the military and using force and believing in a very strong military, throwing a lot of money at it. A is the alliance system we talked about. So in World War I, for example, we talked about Britain, France, and Russia as an alliance, and that alliance was against the so-called Central Powers. So that's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy for a very brief period in the war. So that's the alliance system. And why is that a problem? Well, if you have 3 countries in an alliance and 3 countries in another alliance, if this country attacks this country, then the other ones are going to join in. And this is what makes it a world war. So if you remember that, and the more people jump into the conflict, the worse the war gets. The longer it can go on, the greater amount of damage, the higher number of casualties, and so on, right? So that's militarism, alliances. The I, M-A-I-N, so I was imperialism, if you remember that. And imperialism is this idea that you want to build an empire. In other words, go out and take over territory, grab land, grab territory for your own, and use its resources, excuse me, and its people as tax base, as soldiers, whatever you need them for, and therefore expand your power, expand your wealth, become a stronger country. Well, if all countries are believing in imperialism, the only thing you can do is take land from each other, right? So that's going to create a real problem in a place like Europe, where all of the land is sort of spoken for. And then finally, N, which is nationalism. So nationalism is an intense pride in your country. Okay, now that's World War I, but those things still exist for World War II. we haven't learned our lessons very well. So people still believe in militarism and alliances and imperialism and nationalism. Now, you throw in something like the Great Depression, and oh my gosh, boy, have we got the right pot of soup for a problem. So this slide number 2 I'm on, it says worldwide problems at the top. And what it's talking about is that the Depression hit every country, some countries worse than others. High unemployment, we talked about that. Poor harvest, so the drought, that means things didn't grow, and so on and so forth. And the cleanup after the Great War, it had hit people pretty hard. And the world had changed drastically in a very short time. Now, we're going to get to Germany in just a minute at the bottom of the slide deck, but before we even get to that slide, I want to give you a bit of a background. So the Great Depression is bad for everybody. Every country's having a big problem, but no country is having a problem. No so-called developed country, I mean wealthy, modern, industrial country, is having as tough of a time of it as Germany. And part of the reason for that is they've gotten land taken away from them, and then with some of that land, they also had some resources taken away from them. So very famously, there's a famous region in Germany called the Saar Coal Valley, and in that valley are massive coal mines. You know, coal that we burn for heat. Well, that coal is used to fire industry. So the steel plants down here all would have run on coal. Electrical generation power, eventually, some of it begins to run on coal, and so on. So coal is very important. Well, coal is taken away from the Germans. So is the land taken away from the Germans. Population, some people are taken away from the Germans. That means less taxes. And now they have to pay billions and billions and billions of dollars to other countries to help pay for the damage of World War I. So the Great Depression hit America really hard. It hit Canada really hard, France really hard, and so on, Britain really hard. But Germany was hit particularly hard because it had to pay out all this money and it lost all these resources. Okay, so that's kind of what it's talking about. So the last bullet on this slide says the world had changed drastically in a very short time. And hopefully you can see that. I mean, look at all the changes we've talked about. My gosh, we've talked about changes with regard to women's rights, the way women are dressing, their hairstyles. We've talked about changes in music. We've talked about changes in technology. We've talked about developments of society and culture and those kind of things. I mean, this really is a period of really rapid change. Okay, so then we're talking about first about the democracies, and then we're going to talk about the ones who are not democracies. So really quickly, democracies are a type of government where the people, the regular people, not the leaders, not those, the people have a vote and a say on at least the leadership, on at least who will lead them. So say, for example, right now, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who I think is trying to do his very best in a very difficult time for Canadians. But let's just say, for example, he doesn't continue on as Prime Minister. Well, now we get to vote on the next leader, the next MPs, members of Parliament, and then the leader from that political party will be our Prime Minister. And we get a say in that. We get to vote in that process if you're over the age of 18. Sorry, if you're not. In some countries, you don't get any vote whatsoever. Okay, so a place like Iran, there's no voting for who is going to be the Ayatollah. The Ayatollah is chosen by a different method. Okay, so, but that, when we say democracies, we're talking really about voting. So Canada first, and you can see, we talked about the Dust Bowl. We talked about, by the way, slide number 3, I'm sorry. We're on slide number 3. So the democracies, Canada. The Dust Bowl, cities had a great deal of unemployment. As farmers left their farms looking for work because their crops had dried up, they can't sell anything, there's no money coming in, they moved to the cities to try and find work. And you can imagine that made unemployment worse because the cities, unfortunately, already had a high unemployment rate. Now you're adding more people coming into the cities looking for work. Pretty tough. Canadian governments tried to solve their own problems rather than worrying about other countries. No one wanted another war. Some new political parties were born, but had little effect. So we had socialists and communists. You don't ever need to know the names of these, but for example, there's one called the Social Democratic Party, and so on. A lot of these people were looking at the Union Nationale. A lot of these parties were looking for new solutions and new answers. The Social Credit Party, for example, wanted to give everybody $25 a month. Okay, pretty interesting idea, giving people money to go out and spend on the economy. Okay, I'm slide number 4 now. Democracies, the USA. excuse me, similar to Canada, right? The Depression had hit cities hard, and they too had a drought in the West. So places like North Dakota and South Dakota and Wisconsin, places like this, they had a pretty tough time of it too. Famously Oklahoma, if you know anything about a story called The Grapes of Wrath, those kinds of things. So the president, his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay, began these so-called make-work projects. So his idea was to take government money and spend it on things like bridges, highways, what they call infrastructure, developing everything. And once you did that, you would put men to work. So men who were unemployed, they could go and get jobs building highways, building big public works, big bridges, things like that. And you're also going to be improving the transportation network, for example, in your country, building railroads and that kind of things to ship goods across the country. So hopefully the economy is going to get going. An interesting idea. So the Americans, just like the Canadians, were very hesitant to join World War II, or join World War I, pardon me, and they had no desire to be involved in another war. So if you remember me talking in class, World War I started in 1914. Well, the Americans didn't join then like Canada did. You remember Canada was automatically part of the war because England declared war. Well, not the Americans. The Americans decided not to. So 1914, 1915, 16. So they didn't even get in the war until 1917. But once they did, boy, they were sure in it. Okay? And they wanted peace in the world, but did not want to join the League of Nations. An interesting choice. So America comes up with this idea that we're going to have something called the League of Nations. It's basically like about it like a big club for countries. And this club is going to basically include as many countries as possible. The idea is if every country or a lot of countries are part of the same club, then these countries will not want to go to war against each other. I mean, if you're all sort of in the same group, in the same kind of bunch, hopefully you want to stay out of trouble, right? And not attack each other because you're buddies. So, but the United States, of course, did not join this exclusive group, and that was a real problem. Okay, going on to the next slide now. We're on slide number 5. So the democracies, Great Britain. Okay, so the Great War had exhausted the country, which still had a huge empire to administer. 1926 saw a general strike. Remember we talked about what a strike is? That's a lot of workers who refuse to work until they get better wages and better conditions and maybe a bit more time off, shorter work weeks perhaps, shorter work days, and then work safety on the job, right? So a lot of people were refusing to work until they had some of these basic conditions met. So a big strike in 1926 in England. Only a few leaders speak about the growing problems in Europe. Others want to deal with the problems at home. So we're going to talk really quickly, not a lot, about the two leaders that are in this slide, okay? So remember, America was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For Great Britain, the gentleman on the left is a guy named Neville Chamberlain. He, very early in the war, this is kind of coming up, and you'll have to maybe read about this at some other time if you want to learn more about it, but very early on in the war, he tried to please Hitler. It was called appeasement by letting him take over some territory. It didn't work, and Hitler kept taking territory. It didn't please him at all. He wanted more. Can anybody tell me who the guy on the right is? See the guy with the cool hat, that big bowler cap on slide number 5 there? Anybody know who that is? There's a school not too far away from us named after this guy. That's Winston Churchill. Yeah, you've probably heard that name before. So that's Winston Churchill right there. And he becomes, in 1940, the Prime Minister of England and begins to lead England through World War II. Okay, I want you to go to slide number 6, and I'm not going to talk about it very much, but the British Empire in 1927 was still pretty big. I mean, you can see it has many countries in Africa that it claims as colonies. It has India, it has Australia, it has Canada, it has England, Ireland, Wales, and, Scotland as part of its empire. So pretty large and pretty powerful, even though England itself is a fairly tiny half of an island, right? Okay, and then our excuse me, our last democracy, France. France was also devastated by the war. They were very nervous that Germany was right next door. So if you remember our map, right? So Germany, this is so hard to do opposite. Darn it. Okay, so Germany and France are right beside each other. Sorry, I don't want to get left and right mixed up in my video. Germany and France were right beside each other. So when World War I happened, the French had to confront the Germans first. As a matter of fact, the French almost lost their capital city. Do you guys know what the capital city of France is? Paris. Yeah, you got it. So they almost lost their capital city of Paris in World War I. So they were pretty nervous that Germany was building up power and building up resources and looking pretty aggressive. So they were pretty nervous to be next door. They also had strikes, just like a lot of other countries because of the Great Depression. And however, Paris became kind of the hub of cultural activities. So a lot of very famous writers moved there. As a matter of fact, if you ever get to go to Paris, there's this cool little bookstore. It's called Shakespeare and Company. And it's very famous for a lot of the famous writers around the world who came to Paris and gathered at this one bookstore. It's kind of a cool spot. It's right near Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, as they say in French, the big cathedral there. You know the Hunchback of Notre Dame? It's right beside that cathedral. So go check that out at some point if you can ever get to France. Okay, so the democracies, new countries. After World War I, they redrew the map of Europe. Okay, and you can see Poland began with a democratic government, but slipped into a dictatorship. Hungary also began with, remember we had Austria-Hungary as one big country? Well, now it's just Hungary. And Hungary had begun well, but had a communist revolution in 1919, which fell quickly. And then Czechoslovakia was the only successor state to maintain a democratic government throughout the entire period between the two wars. So Czechoslovakia, which now today we have the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but back then it was Czechoslovakia. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Okay, now we're going to move into the dictatorships. So a dictatorship is basically a government where either one leader, usually it's always one leader, but sometimes dictatorships do rule by sort of kind of a committee or a commissar, but it usually always falls to one individual. So a dictatorship is where that one individual has all of the power. So a good example of a dictatorship is Adolf Hitler with Nazi Germany. If you know anything about Russian history, after about 1924, Joseph Stalin in Russia, which then was the USSR. Okay, another dictatorship, the Emperor Hirohito, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And in this case, we're talking about Italy and a guy named Benito Mussolini. They also called him Il Duce. Okay, Il Duce. Il Duce translates from Italian to mean the Duke. But what he meant was, I am the leader, I am the boss. When he called himself the Il Duce, like I'm the Duke, he meant to say, I'm the most powerful guy. So he was a former journalist. That means he wrote for newspapers. He began his fascist party after the Great War. Fascism is another concept that centers around a totalitarian government, usually with a secret police, enforcement of laws for what they call the common good. Whether or not the common good is up for debate. But a fascist government is a dictatorship. It's a type of dictatorship, okay, basically. So, and then he had his group of thugs. They were called black shirts, and they attracted unemployed veterans and those who wanted more law and order. So unemployed veterans, a lot of the people who came back from the First World War couldn't get jobs, and they were very upset about that, so they went to Benito Mussolini. So after they had a general strike as well, and then he marched on Rome and took over power and took on the government. Okay, the next dictatorship, I just mentioned this guy. His name is Joseph Stalin, okay? And he becomes a dictator of the Soviet Union, or the USSR. Now, it used to be called Russia, but after their revolution in 1917, then they become the Soviet Union, or begin to morph into the Soviet Union. So there's my first point there. The Communist Revolution in 1917 took Russia out of the First World War, and then they became a communist country. Unfortunately, they grabbed their royal family, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife and children. They put them under house arrest for a period of time, and then they killed them all. I think I mentioned this is the basis of the Disney film Anastasia and the one girl who survives. That girl, Anastasia, was the daughter of the Tsar Nicholas II. Anyway, Joseph Stalin and another guy named Lenin. Lenin's kind of the chief guy at this time. They take over the Soviet Union and they take over Russia. After Lenin dies in 1924, Stalin rises up. He takes over, and you can see the government controlled all aspects of life. When I say all aspects of life, it was illegal to say things against the government. That's not true here. If you disagree with something that our prime minister does, you are free to voice that disapproval in a respectful way. You can't threaten the prime minister, but you can say the prime minister is doing a terrible job at this, or well, that was not possible in Russia at this time. To do that could wind you up in a very special prison called a gulag. So Joseph Stalin took over after the death of Lenin, I already said that, and then began a series of 5-year plans. What he wanted to do was to turn Russia, which was largely a farming country, into an industrial power, kind of like Hamilton, but all across the entire country, building and producing and churning out things for industry, creating jobs. In Spain, I'm going on to slide number 12 now. Sorry, I hope you're keeping up with me on slides. So on slide number 12 now, the dictatorships, a guy named Francisco Franco overthrew his government, followed by a revolutionary war in Spain. The civil war that followed after his takeover was pretty brutal. Very famous painting. If I was in class, I'd show you. It's called Guernica. It's a huge, very famous painting by Picasso. You can maybe Google that on your own. So after this, Franco. The civil war that followed, with Mussolini and Hitler supporting Franco, and the democracies worried about their own problems. So the democracies could have stepped in and stopped people like Franco and stopped people like Benito Mussolini from rising to power, stopping Hitler from rising to power. That's what this point is trying to say, but they didn't. They concentrated on their own problems at home. Okay, on to slide number 13. We're almost done, by the way. We only have one slide after this one, I believe. 2 slides after this one. And here we're talking about Japan. Now, Japan had a very special dictatorship. They had something called an emperor, except the Japanese people were told that the emperor was divine, or kind of like a god, right? So not only are they supposed to listen to him, but they're also supposed to kind of be worshipful and very respectful of him. He was seen as something like kind of like a half god, and you can see in the point it says more than human. So for a generation, they had built up their military, and by the 1930s, the government was basically controlled by army officers. So they had the emperor here, but they had a number of very powerful army officers who controlled everything, including the economy. So if they wanted tanks built, for example, then the army officers took over factories and ordered them to build tanks. That's very much what a dictatorship looks like. Okay, our last dictatorship, maybe the most famous and the one you've probably heard the most about, Germany. And I've already talked to you a little bit about Adolf Hitler, his role in World War I, how that embittered him and a lot of other Nazis. And when he rose up, he was rising up during the Great Depression. So people were desperate. Germany was hit worse than other developed countries. And that gave a lot of openings for people like Adolf Hitler, really loud people, really boisterous people, to go up and seize power. And there's a picture right there I want you to take a look at. Can you see what she's burning? We're on slide number 14 right now, or 13, pardon me. Can you see what she's burning? She's burning stacks of money. And the reason she's burning stacks of money is because inflation, that means the price of goods, is rising way faster than the value of dollars. So overnight, the price of bread would double, triple, sometimes like rise 20 times. So if you go to bed, bread's $1, you wake up the next morning, bread's $23, but your dollar's still $1. Does that make any sense? So money became valueless. So she's actually burning money because it's cheaper than wood. If I was in class, I'd do another lesson on hyperinflation, but I'm just going to stick to, hopefully, the basics. Okay? So Adolf Hitler was asked to be chancellor in 1933. He won the election to become head of the Nazi Party. Then he's asked to become chancellor. And then they had a fire at their parliament building. It's called the Reichstag. So they had a fire there, which Hitler very quickly blamed on Jewish communists. And you can see where all that's going, leading into the Holocaust, and unfortunately, again, blaming Jewish people for a lot of problems. Okay? So that's an overview of the leaders leading up to World War II. So moving into this week, we're going to talk about Canada's role in the war, and we're also going to be taking a look at the events, the major events of the war as best I can. It's very difficult to do a lot of that. I want to just focus on some of the basics, so it might be a bit, sort of points and points and points, but try and stay with me. If you have any questions or if you ever need any help, again, always email me, or I can call you, or we can video conference, or whatever you need to do. You can also join us for our weekly meetings, which we're going to be having next week. We didn't have one this week. We had a lot of staff meetings and so on, but next week we're going to have another class meeting on Microsoft Teams. Okay, and then the final slide here, it says, why didn't we do something sooner? So basically the idea is we see these dictators rising up in their power. We see these dictators rising up in their power, and we do nothing to stop them. So when Hitler is becoming more powerful, and eventually he's racing out and taking over territories, why aren't we racing in to stop him? Okay, that's a good question. So basically, everybody was overwhelmed with their own stuff at home. The Great Depression had every government busy looking to try and take care of its own interests. In this case, no one also wanted to start another war. Everyone remembered World War I. Remember how horrible that was? Nobody was in a rush to get into another war. Okay, so a quick little exit card, which you can do on a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word document. Here's just your sort of question, and you can use this video and the PowerPoint to try and answer it. So using 3 or 4 complete sentences, so I want capital letters at the beginning, I want a period at the end. I want you to try and explain why the Great Depression might have allowed Hitler to take power. And I have a little hint for you here. Why do you think the people would have voted for him? What would he have been offering? Or what problems were there that people wanted to escape and get away from? Okay, I've already gone 31 minutes, and I'm sorry for the length of this video, but I hope I had some good information here. I also apologize for kind of the rambling nature of things. I'm not a video guy. I do better in class, but I'm doing my best. Again, there's your exit card. I'm going to put an assignment box on the hub. You can see it. So the PowerPoint's going to be on the hub. This link will be in the announcements section. And then I will have a little assignment box for your exit card about this PowerPoint. Okay, so I wish you all the best. I hope your family and you are doing well, and take care.